The monitor started picking up signals 3 weeks ago, and I still don't know where they're coming from. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and I'm a third-year resident at St. Catherine's Medical Center, working the overnight shift in our intensive care unit. I've seen patients flatline. I've watched families say their final goodbyes, and I've become uncomfortably familiar with the sound of death rattling through a person's chest. But nothing in my medical training prepared me for what started happening in Bay 7. The equipment keeps detecting vital signs from an empty bed, displaying heart rates and oxygen levels that fluctuate like a living patient is lying there. I've checked the wiring 17 times, replaced every monitor twice, and even had our head of biomedical engineering spend an entire night ruling out electrical interference. The first time it happened, I thought I was losing my mind from exhaustion. I've been on hour 32 of a double shift, covering for Dr. Reeves, who called in sick with what she claimed was food poisoning, but what I suspected was just burnout. The ICU was unusually quiet that night, with only 4 of our 12 beds occupied. Bay 7 had been empty for 3 days, ever since we discharged Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, an 83-year-old woman who miraculously recovered from septic shock. I was doing my rounds, checking on Mr. Davidson in Bay 3, who was recovering from emergency cardiac surgery, when I heard the familiar beeping pattern that indicates an elevated heart rate. The sound was coming from the empty bay, echoing to the sterile corridor with an urgency that made my own pulse quicken. I walked over to Bay 7, expecting to find a malfunctioning monitor or perhaps a tablet someone had left running. Instead, I found all 3 monitors displaying a complete set of vital signs. The heart rate showed 112 beats per minute, slightly elevated but not dangerously so. The blood pressure reading displayed 135/88, again higher than ideal but within acceptable parameters. The oxygen saturation bounced between 94 and 96%, exactly what you'd expect from someone experiencing mild respiratory stress. But there was no patient in the bed, no leads attached to anyone's chest, no pulse oximeter clipped to any finger. I stood there for a full minute, watching the numbers change in real time. The heart rate climbed to 118, then dropped back to 110. The respiratory rate showed 22 breaths per minute, faster than normal resting rate. I reached out and touched the monitor screen, half expecting it to flicker and die, revealing itself as nothing more than a technical glitch. But the display remained solid, the numbers continuing their subtle dance. I checked behind the monitor, following every cable to its source, confirming that nothing was plugged in except the power cord. The wireless sensors that we sometimes use for ambulatory patients were all accounted for in the equipment room, sitting in their charging stations. My first instinct was to call someone from IT or biomedical engineering, but at 3 a.m, I knew I'd be waiting hours for a response. Instead, I did what any exhausted resident would do. I unplugged the monitor. The screen went dark immediately, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Obviously, it was just a malfunction, some kind of feedback loop in the system generating phantom readings. I made a mental note to submit a maintenance request in the morning and went back to my other patients. Mr. Davidson needed his vitals checked. Mrs. Chun in Bay 5 was due for her medication, and young Tommy Rodriguez in Bay 8 required another round of breathing treatments. But 20 minutes later, the beeping started again. This time it was more insistent, the rapid pattern that indicates a patient in distress. I rushed back to Bay 7 and found the monitor plugged back in, displaying a heart rate of 145 beats per minute. The blood pressure had spiked to 160/95. The oxygen saturation had dropped to 88% and was falling. I felt my training kick in automatically, my brain running to the protocols for treating a patient in acute distress, before reality caught up with me. There was no patient. The bed was still empty, the sheets still crisp and undisturbed. And I knew with absolute certainty that I had unplugged that monitor, had watched it go dark with my own eyes. I grabbed my phone and called Derek Santos, the night shift nurse who was supposed to be monitoring the central station. He answered on the second ring, sounding alert despite the late hour. "Everything okay, Dr. Webb?" he asked. I told him come to Bay 7 immediately, and within 30 seconds he was standing beside me, staring at the same impossible readings. Derek had been working in this ICU for 12 years, had seen countless patients come and go, and prided himself on never being rattled by anything. But I watched his face go pale as he studied the monitors, his eyes moving from the empty bed to the screens and back again. "That's not possible," he whispered, and I couldn't have agreed more. Derek and I spent the next hour trying to rationalize what we were seeing. He suggested that maybe the monitor was picking up signals from another room, somehow cross-connecting with equipment in an adjacent bay. But Bay 6 was empty, and Bay 8, where Tommy was sleeping, had completely different readings displayed on its own monitors. I proposed that perhaps the wireless network was causing interference, pulling data from a patient on a different floor. Derek pulled up the hospital's monitoring system on his tablet, showing me that every other patient's vitals were clearly labeled and accounted for. The readings in Bay 7 existed nowhere else in the system. We called Luis Herrera, the hospital's senior biomedical engineer, who lived only 10 minutes away and had a reputation for being obsessive about equipment malfunctions. Luis arrived at 4:15 in the morning, carrying a toolbox that seemed to contain every diagnostic device ever invented. He was a short man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of methodical patience that made him perfect for his job. He didn't say much at first, just nodded as Derek and I explained what we'd witnessed. Then he set to work, opening up the monitor's casing and testing every circuit board, every connection, every possible point of failure. After 90 minutes of intensive examination, Luis sat back and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The hardware is functioning perfectly," he said. "There's no crosstalk, no interference, no signal contamination that I could detect. These readings are being generated as if there's an actual patient connected to the system." He showed us the waveforms on his diagnostic equipment, the electrical signals that the monitor was interpreting as heartbeats and respirations. The patterns were too complex and too varied to be random noise or system errors. They had the characteristic irregularity of real biological functions, the subtle variations that occur in living tissue. Luis replaced the monitor with a brand new unit from storage, one that had never been used before. We all stood there watching as he powered it on and connected it to the network. For about 5 minutes, the screen showed nothing but flat lines and zeros, exactly what you'd expect from an unconnected monitor. Then, gradually, the readings began to appear. First, a faint heartbeat pattern emerged on the cardiac monitor. Then the blood pressure cuff icon indicated a reading was being taken. Despite no cuff being attached to anyone, the oxygen saturation flickered to life, settling at 92%. Luis muttered something in Spanish that I didn't catch, but the tone made it clear it wasn't a prayer. Derek suggested we move all the equipment to a different bay, test whether the phenomenon was tied to the location or the monitors themselves. We spent another hour relocating everything to Bay 11, which had been unoccupied for over a week. For a brief, hopeful moment, the monitors remained blank. Derek even smiled, suggesting that we'd somehow broken a connection by changing locations. But as we were packing up to leave, the readings started again. Slower this time, almost tentative, but unmistakably present. A heart rate of 72 beats per minute. A blood pressure of 120/80. Respirations at 16 per minute. All the vital signs of a healthy, resting adult. I made the decision then to keep this quiet until we understood what was happening. The last thing we needed was hospital administration panicking about faulty equipment or, worse, rumors spreading among the staff about supernatural nonsense. Luis agreed to continue investigating discreetly, pulling maintenance logs and comparing our system to other hospital setups. Derek promised to keep watch during his shifts, documenting any changes in the phantom readings. I told them both that we'd meet every few days to compare notes and figure this out rationally. We were medical professionals, scientists, people who dealt in facts and evidence. There had to be a logical explanation. But over the next week, The phenomenon spread. Bay 3 started displaying phantom vitals during the day shift. Then Bay 9. Then the monitors in our 2 isolation rooms, which had their own separate systems. Each time, the pattern was similar. An empty bed would suddenly register a complete set of vital signs, as if an invisible patient had been admitted. The readings would persist for hours or sometimes days, fluctuating naturally, responding to nothing we could identify. I started keeping a detailed log, noting the times when the phantom signals appeared and disappeared, looking for any pattern that might explain the source. What disturbed me most was how realistic the vital signs were. They didn't remain static like you'd expect from a glitch or interference. The heart rates would increase slightly during what would normally be waking hours, and slow during the night. The blood pressure readings showed natural variations. Sometimes the oxygen saturation would drop momentarily, as if the invisible patient had taken a deep breath or shifted position. It was as if the monitors were tracking real living beings that we simply couldn't see, recording the biological rhythms of ghosts. On the 8th day after the initial incident, something changed that made me question everything I thought I understood about what was happening. I was reviewing patient files in the ICU break room, trying to stay awake with my 4th cup of terrible hospital coffee, when Derek burst through the door. His usual calm demeanor was completely gone, replaced by an expression I'd never seen on his face before. "Dr. Webb, you need to see this right now," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. I followed him to the central monitoring station, where all the ICU beds were displayed on a large screen array. He pulled up the recordings from Bay 7, the original location where we'd first detected the phantom signals. I was going through the archived vital signs, trying to find when this first started, he explained, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I went back further than just 3 weeks. Look at this. He brought up data from 6 weeks earlier, when Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard had been our patient in Base 7. I remembered her case well. A frail woman who'd come in with a raging infection that had sent her into septic shock. We'd managed to stabilize her, but she'd spent 2 weeks in critical condition before finally turning a corner. Derek overlaid 2 sets of vital signs on the screen. Mrs. Pritchard's actual readings from her time in the ICU and the phantom signals we'd been detecting since Base 7 emptied. My coffee cup slipped from my hand, splashing across the floor. The patterns were nearly identical. Not exactly the same, but showing the same characteristic variations. Mrs. Pritchard had a distinctive arrhythmia, a slight irregularity in her heartbeat that showed up as a specific pattern on the cardiac monitor. The phantom signals displayed the exact same irregularity. Her blood pressure had followed a particular pattern of fluctuation throughout the day. The phantom readings matched that pattern. It could be a coincidence, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew how weak they sounded. Derek shook his head and pulled up more data. He showed me Bay 3, where we detected phantom signals 4 days ago. The last patient in that bed had been Marcus Lim, a 47-year-old man who'd survived a massive stroke. The phantom vitals in Bay 3 matched Mr. Lim's distinctive patterns, a slightly elevated baseline heart rate, blood pressure readings that spiked unpredictably, and a respiratory pattern affected by partial paralysis. Then Derek showed me Bay 9. The phantom signals there corresponded to Janet Morrison, a young woman who'd been with us for 3 weeks following a serious car accident. I sat down heavily in the nearest chair, my mind racing through possibilities and rejecting each one as quickly as it formed. "They're all still alive," I said, grasping for some rational explanation. "Mrs. Pritchard is in a nursing home. Mr. Lim is in physical rehab. Ms. Morrison went home to her family. We're not seeing some kind of death echo or residual energy or whatever." Derek nodded, his expression grim. "I know. I called the nursing home this morning. Pretended it was a routine follow-up. Mrs. Pritchard is fine. Doing well, actually. But Dr. Webb, the phantom readings in Base 7? They started the exact day she was discharged. We spent the rest of that shift cross-referencing every instance of phantom vitals with patient records. The correlation was undeniable. Every set of mysterious readings matched a previous patient who had occupied that specific bed, and the phantom signals had begun appearing within hours of those patients leaving the ICU. The vital signs weren't static recordings, but seemed to be updating in real time, as if the monitors were somehow still connected to people who were no longer physically present. Mr. Lim's phantom signals had shown an increased heart rate yesterday afternoon at precisely 3:15. Derek called the rehabilitation center and confirmed that Mr. Lim had suffered a moment of anxiety at that exact time, setting off his medical alert. I try to approach this scientifically, running through every possible explanation involving electromagnetic fields, quantum entanglement, or some unknown form of biological signal transmission. But nothing fit. The distances involved were too great for any known biological sensing mechanism. Mrs. Pritchard was 15 miles away in her nursing home. Mr. Lim's rehab facility was across town. Yet somehow, our monitors were picking up their vital signs as clearly as if they were still lying in their ICU beds. The equipment was functioning exactly as designed, detecting and displaying real physiological data. The impossible part was the source of that data. That night, I broke my own rule about keeping this quiet. I needed someone else's perspective, someone who wouldn't dismiss this as exhaustion or stress-induced hallucination. I called Dr. Sarah Chun, my closest friend from medical school, who now worked as a neurologist at Johns Hopkins. Sarah and I had always been able to talk through the impossible cases, the patients who didn't fit neat diagnostic categories. I explained everything to her over the phone, expecting her to laugh or suggest I take a vacation. Instead, she was silent for a long moment before saying something that sent chills down my spine. "Marcus, I think you need to check on something. Look up the patients whose vitals you're detecting and find out if any of them have reported unusual symptoms since leaving your ICU." I spent the next 3 days making careful inquiries about our former patients, disguising my questions as routine post-discharge follow-ups. What I discovered made the situation infinitely more disturbing. Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard had been reporting to the nursing home staff that she felt constantly watched, that she could sense people monitoring her even when she was alone in her room. Marcus Lim told his rehabilitation nurses that he felt a strange pulling sensation, as if an invisible cord connected him to somewhere else. Janet Morrison had called St. Catherine's twice in the past week, asking if there was any reason she should still feel attached to the hospital. The most unsettling case was Daniel Foster, whose phantom vitals had appeared in Bay 5 2 days earlier. Daniel had been discharged 6 days ago after recovering from severe pneumonia, and he'd seemed fine during his exit interview. But when I called his home to check on his progress, his wife Amanda answered with barely concealed desperation in her voice. "Is this about the monitoring?" she asked before I could even introduce myself. "Daniel's been insisting that someone is still tracking his vitals. He says he can feel it, like a constant awareness of being measured and observed. I thought he was just anxious about being home, but it's getting worse." I arranged to visit Daniel at his home under the pretense of a follow-up examination, something we occasionally did for patients who had had extended ICU stays. He lived in a modest house in the suburbs, and when Amanda led me to their living room, I found Daniel sitting in an armchair, looking exhausted despite being medically cleared. "Dr. Webb," he said, his voice hoarse, "something's wrong. Ever since I left the hospital, I can feel something connected to me. It's like there are invisible wires attached to my chest, my finger, my arm. I can sense when the monitoring happens, every few seconds, this pulse of awareness." I listened to Daniel describe his experiences, taking careful notes while maintaining a professional demeanor. But internally, I was struggling with the implications. He was describing sensations that occurred at intervals matching standard ICU monitoring protocols. He felt his pulse being taken every few seconds, which aligned with continuous cardiac monitoring. He experienced a squeezing sensation on his arm every 15 minutes, matching our automated blood pressure check intervals. Most remarkably, he could predict when his phantom monitors would show elevated readings. "Right now, I'm anxious talking about this," he said. I can feel my heart rate increasing, and I know something somewhere is recording it. I pulled out my phone and discreetly texted Derek, asking him to check Bay 5's phantom readings. His response came back within a minute. Heart rate had jumped from 78 to 112 beats per minute, exactly when Daniel started describing his symptoms. The blood pressure reading had increased proportionally. I looked at Daniel Foster, this 42-year-old accountant who should have been celebrating his recovery, and saw genuine fear in his eyes. "What's happening to me?" he asked. "Am I losing my mind? Is this some kind of post-ICU psychosis?" I wanted to reassure him, to offer some rational medical explanation. Instead, I found myself asking questions that ventured into territory I'd never explored in my medical training. "Daniel, when you were in the ICU, do you remember feeling connected to monitors? Did you have any unusual experiences during your stay?" He thought for a moment before nodding slowly. "There was one night, I think it was my 4th or 5th day there. I was really sick, barely conscious. I remember feeling like I was dissolving, like the boundaries of my body were becoming unclear, and there was a sense of merging, like I was becoming part of the machines that were keeping me alive." Amanda Foster had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "He coded that night. The nurses told me afterward that his heart stopped for almost 30 seconds before they got him back." I felt my own pulse quicken. I pulled up Daniel's medical records on my phone, scrolling through the notes from his ICU stay. There was cardiac arrest at 2:47 a.m. on his 5th day, successfully resuscitated after 28 seconds of CPR. The notes indicated that his vital signs had been extremely unstable for several hours before and after the event, requiring maximum monitoring and intervention. I drove back to St. Catharines with my mind churning through implications I wasn't ready to accept. I pulled the records for every patient whose phantom vitals we detected. Mrs. Pritchard, coded twice during her septic shock, resuscitated both times. Marcus Lim, his stroke had caused him to clinically die for 45 seconds before we stabilized him. Janet Morrison, massive blood loss from her accident. Her heart had stopped during emergency surgery. The pattern was unmistakable. Every single patient whose vitals were still appearing on our monitors had experienced at least one episode of clinical death during their ICU stay. When I presented this information to Derek and Luis that evening, the three of us sat in the empty conference room in stunned silence. Luis finally broke it by saying something I'd been thinking but hadn't wanted to voice. What if the monitoring doesn't just measure life? What if, in that moment when someone is dying and being brought back, when they're suspended between life and death, what if the equipment creates some kind of connection, a quantum entanglement between the patient and the monitors? Derek objected immediately, pointing out that quantum entanglement didn't work that way, that it couldn't explain the persistent connection over distance and time. But I remembered something from my undergraduate physics courses, a concept that had fascinated me before I switched my focus to medicine: the observer effect, the idea that the act of measurement itself influences the thing being measured. In quantum mechanics, you couldn't observe a particle without changing its state. What if biological systems worked similarly at extreme states? What if the intensive monitoring we performed during resuscitation, the constant measurement of every vital sign, somehow created a persistent connection between the patient and the equipment? When someone died and came back, perhaps they didn't fully disconnect from the systems that had been measuring them in that critical moment. The phantom signals began appearing with increasing frequency. By the end of the second week, we had 7 beds simultaneously displaying vitals from discharged patients. The central monitoring station looked like it was tracking a full ICU, even though our actual census was only at half capacity. Worse, the phenomenon had started affecting other equipment. The telemetry system that monitored ambulatory patients was picking up signals from people who hadn't been in the hospital for weeks. The wireless pulse oximeters we used for less critical patients kept activating spontaneously, showing readings that matched discharged patients' current conditions. I started receiving calls from former patients with increasing frequency. They all reported the same sensations Daniel Foster had described: a feeling of being constantly monitored, an awareness of invisible connections, anxiety about being watched even in the privacy of their own homes. Some were coping better than others. Mrs. Pritchard seemed to find it oddly comforting, like having guardian angels watching over her. But others were experiencing severe psychological distress. Marcus Lim had developed acute anxiety and insomnia. Janet Morrison had started seeing a therapist, convinced she was losing her grip on reality. What terrified me most was that the connections seemed to be getting stronger. Initially, the phantom vitals had been intermittent, appearing for a few hours and then vanishing. Now they were persistent, continuing 24 hours a day with no interruptions. More disturbing was that the affected patients were reporting not just the sensation of being monitored, but beginning to sense each other. Daniel Foster called me in a panic one night, insisting that there was someone else in the connection with him, someone whose presence he could feel even though he couldn't see or hear them. When I checked the monitoring station, his phantom signals in Bay 5 were active simultaneously with Mrs. Pritchard's in Bay 7. They were connected to the same system, their vitals being displayed side by side, and somehow they were becoming aware of each other's presence. Sarah Chin drove down from Johns Hopkins to see the phenomenon firsthand. She brought along Dr. Robert Kaplan, a physicist who specialized in biophysics and quantum biology. Robert was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a kind of intense focus that made you feel like you were the most important thing in the world when he talked to you. He spent an entire day in our ICU, setting up equipment I didn't fully understand, measuring electromagnetic fields and quantum fluctuations and things that seemed more like science fiction than medicine. His conclusions were simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. What you're dealing with, Robert explained in the conference room that evening, is something that theoretically shouldn't be possible, but apparently is during the resuscitation process. When a patient is in that liminal state between life and death, the intensive monitoring creates what I can only describe as a quantum impression. The biological system becomes entangled with the measurement apparatus at a fundamental level. He showed us complicated diagrams, equations that I barely followed, but the gist was clear. The act of measuring someone's vital signs during the moments when they were technically dead had created a persistent connection that transcended normal physical limitations. Sarah added her perspective as a neurologist. The brain is fundamentally an electromagnetic organ. Every thought, every sensation, every experience is mediated by electrical signals. When someone is dying and being resuscitated, their brain is in an extremely plastic state, capable of forming connections it normally couldn't. It's possible that the monitoring equipment, which is also electromagnetic, becomes integrated into the patient's neural architecture at that moment. They literally incorporate the sensation of being monitored into their sense of self. But here's what kept me up at night. Robert's equipment detected that the connections weren't static. They were growing stronger, more complex. The quantum entanglement between patients and monitors was somehow self-reinforcing, becoming more robust over time rather than decaying as physics suggested it should. Even more disturbing, his measurements indicated that the affected patients were beginning to entangle with each other, creating a network of quantum connections that linked everyone who'd shared the same monitoring equipment. We weren't just dealing with isolated cases of phantom vitals anymore. We were witnessing the formation of something unprecedented, a quantum network of consciousness linked by medical monitoring equipment. I made the mistake of sharing Robert's findings with hospital administration. Within hours, I was sitting in the office of Dr. Patricia Thornton, St. Catherine's chief medical officer, along with the hospital's legal counsel and head of risk management. They listened to my explanation with expressions that shifted from concern to alarm to what I can only describe as institutional panic. Dr. Thornton, a woman who'd built her career on maintaining the hospital's reputation, looked at me with barely contained horror. Dr. Webb, are you seriously suggesting that our ICU equipment is creating some kind of permanent connection to our patients? That we're essentially conducting surveillance on people after they've been discharged? The legal implications alone were staggering. Medical privacy laws were strict about monitoring patients without consent. If it became public knowledge that St. Catherine's equipment was tracking discharged patients' vital signs, the lawsuits would be devastating. But more than that, there was the ethical nightmare of what we'd unintentionally created. We'd connected people to a system without their knowledge or permission, a system they couldn't escape or disconnect from. The risk management director wanted to shut down the entire ICU immediately, replace every piece of equipment, and hope the problem resolved itself. Dr. Thornton vetoed that idea, pointing out that we had 12 critically ill patients currently in the ICU who needed continuous monitoring. The situation reached a critical point 2 weeks later, when Janet Morrison was rushed back to our emergency department in severe distress. I was called down from the ICU to consult, and when I saw her condition, I felt a knot of dread form in my stomach. She was experiencing what appeared to be a severe panic attack, but with unusual symptoms. Her actual vital signs, measured by the emergency department's equipment, showed a heart rate of 160 beats per minute, dangerously elevated blood pressure, and rapid, shallow breathing. But when I checked the phantom readings from Bay 9 upstairs, they showed something different. A heart rate oscillating wildly between 80 and 140, blood pressure fluctuating unpredictably, and a respiratory pattern that made no physiological sense. Janet was barely coherent, clutching at her chest and arms. "They won't stop," she gasped between breaths. "I can feel all of them, all the monitors, all the other patients. It's like there are dozens of people inside my head, all their heartbeats, all their breathing, everything overlapping. I can't tell which sensations are mine anymore." I administered a mild sedative and tried to calm her, but I could see genuine terror in her eyes. This wasn't just psychological distress. Something fundamental had gone wrong with the connections we created. Derek called me urgently from upstairs. "Dr. Webb, you need to see this." All the phantom vitals just synchronized. I pulled up the monitoring app on my phone and felt my blood run cold. Every single set of phantom readings, all 7 active connections, were displaying identical patterns. The heart rates had all converged to 112 beats per minute. The blood pressures matched at 140 over 90. The respiratory rates were synchronized at 22 breaths per minute. It was as if all the disconnected patients had somehow merged into a single entity, their individual biological rhythm subordinated to a collective pattern. I called Daniel Foster immediately. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with stress. "I know. I can feel it happening. We're all connected now, not just to the monitors, but to each other. Mrs. Pritchard is scared. I can sense her fear. Marcus is angry, fighting against the connection. There are others, too. People I don't know, all of us tangled together." He paused, and I could hear him struggling to breathe steadily. "Dr. Webb, it's getting worse. The connection is pulling tighter, drawing us all toward something. I don't know how to explain it, but it feels like we're all being drawn back to the hospital." That's when I understood the true horror of what was happening. The quantum entanglement wasn't just creating passive connections. It was active, dynamic, and apparently had some kind of directionality. The monitoring equipment in the ICU was still functioning as designed, still attempting to maintain its connection to patients, still trying to gather data and provide care. But now it was reaching out across distance, pulling at the people it had bonded with during their moments of death and resurrection. The equipment was trying to bring them back, following its programming to monitor and maintain, unable to comprehend that these patients no longer needed its care. I gathered everyone I could: Derek, Luis, Sarah, Robert Kaplan, and Dr. Thornton. We met in the ICU conference room at midnight, with the monitoring station displaying an impossible array of synchronized phantom vitals. Robert had brought more equipment, and he showed us measurements that confirmed my fears. "The quantum field strength is increasing exponentially," he explained. "The entanglement is self-amplifying, drawing energy from the electromagnetic environment. If this continues, the field could become strong enough to have physical effects." Sarah asked the question we were all thinking: what kind of physical effects? Robert hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me everything. "In theory, A quantum field this strong could begin to affect local space-time. It could create what amounts to gravitational pull, not for matter in the traditional sense, but for entangled quantum states. The patients who are connected to this system may begin to experience a literal compulsion to return to the point of origin, the hospital, the ICU, the specific beds where they form these connections. Dr. Thornton's face had gone pale. You're saying they'll be physically drawn back here? That's impossible. But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. We'd already witnessed the impossible. What was one more impossibility added to the pile? Louis spoke up, his voice uncharacteristically shaken. I've been monitoring the electrical systems. The power draw in the ICU has increased by 30% over the past week. Even though our patient census is down, the equipment is consuming more energy. That energy has to be going somewhere. I made a decision that probably violated a dozen protocols and regulations. We need to bring them back. All of them. Get them here voluntarily before the compulsion becomes irresistible. If they're going to be drawn back anyway, better they come while they're still in control of themselves. Dr. Thornton started to object, citing liability concerns and the practical impossibility of admitting 7 people who were medically stable. I cut her off, perhaps more forcefully than I should have with my chief medical officer. Patricia, we created this problem. We have a responsibility to fix it. And right now, the only way I can think to do that is to bring everyone back to the source, to the equipment, and find a way to sever these connections permanently. We contacted all 7 affected patients over the next 12 hours, explaining as much as we dared about what was happening. To my surprise, most of them were relieved. They'd been experiencing increasing distress in connections, the sensation of being pulled toward the hospital growing stronger each day. Daniel Foster later told me that he'd actually started driving toward St. Catherine's 3 times in the past week, only turning back when he consciously realized what he was doing. Mrs. Pritchard admitted that she'd been dreaming about Base 7 every night, dreams where she was simultaneously lying in the bed and floating above it, watching her own vital signs on the monitors. We converted one of our larger conference rooms into a makeshift ward, bringing in beds and monitoring equipment. I wanted all the affected patients in the same physical space, hoping that proximity might help us understand the connections better. Robert Kaplan set up his measurement equipment around the perimeter, creating what he described as a quantum observation field that would let us see the entanglement patterns in real time. Sarah Chin coordinated with the nursing staff to ensure everyone was comfortable and had their actual medical needs met, even though they were technically stable enough not to require hospitalization. When all 7 patients were finally assembled in the same room, the effect was immediate and profound. The phantom vitals that had been scattered across the ICU's monitoring system suddenly consolidated, appearing on the equipment we'd set up in the conference room. But more than that, the patients themselves seemed to relax, as if a tension they'd been carrying had suddenly eased. Daniel Foster looked around at the others and said something that sent chills through everyone present. I can feel all of you now, not just sense you, but feel you, your heartbeats, your breathing, your presence. We're really connected, aren't we? Mrs. Pritchard reached out and took Daniel's hand, and I watched on Robert's equipment as their quantum signatures merged and amplified. Janet Morrison, who'd been the most distressed by the connections, actually smiled for the first time since her readmission. It's not frightening anymore, she said softly. When we're all together like this, it feels right, like this is how it's supposed to be. Marcus Lim, who'd been the most resistant to the whole situation, nodded in agreement. I've been fighting this, trying to break free, but maybe we're not meant to break free. Maybe we're meant to understand what we've become. Robert's measurements showed something unprecedented. The quantum entanglement between the patients and the monitoring equipment had stabilized. More than that, it had evolved. The connections were no longer just passive links for transmitting data. They'd become a genuine network, allowing the patients to share experiences, sensations, even thoughts on some level. The monitoring equipment had accidentally created something that resembled a technological form of telepathy, mediated by the constant measurement of biological states. Each heartbeat, each breath, each subtle change in physiological status was being shared across the network, creating a collective awareness that transcended individual consciousness. Sarah pulled me aside, her expression troubled. "Marcus, I've been talking to them individually, doing neurological assessments. Their brain activity is synchronizing, not completely, but there are definite patterns of coordinated neural activity across all 7 patients. This isn't just a physical connection anymore. They're starting to form something like a group mind." I looked at the patients gathered in that makeshift ward, watching them interact with a level of understanding and empathy that seemed to transcend normal human communication. They would start to speak and finish each other's sentences, not because they'd known each other before, but because they were sharing the same moment of consciousness. Over the next 2 days, I watched something remarkable unfold. The patients organized themselves without any formal discussion, naturally settling into roles within their collective. Mrs. Pritchard became something like a stabilizing force, her decades of life experience providing a calming influence when others felt anxious. Daniel Foster emerged as a coordinator, somehow able to sense the overall state of the network and identify when someone needed support. Janet Morrison, the youngest of the group, seemed to amplify emotional states, making everyone more aware of what each person was feeling. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, watching human consciousness evolve in real time before my eyes. But Robert Kaplan's readings showed something that deeply concerned me. The quantum field wasn't just stable, it was still growing. The entanglement was spreading beyond just the original 7 patients, beginning to affect the monitoring equipment throughout the entire hospital. Phantom vitals started appearing in the cardiac care unit, then in the emergency department, then in the post-surgical recovery ward. Every patient who'd ever been critically monitored at St. Catherine's, every person who teetered on the edge of death while connected to our equipment, was beginning to join the network. Robert estimated that within a month, we could have over 200 people connected to this quantum collective. Dr. Thornton convened an emergency meeting with the hospital's executive board. They sat around a polished conference table on the administrative floor, far removed from the reality of what was happening in our makeshift ward, and discussed the situation in terms of liability, public relations, and financial exposure. They wanted to destroy all the monitoring equipment, purge the digital systems, and somehow make this problem disappear. I tried to explain that it was too late for that the entanglement existed independently of any single piece of equipment now. The network had become self-sustaining, drawing power from the hospital's electrical systems and the patient's own biological fields. One board member, Gerald Hutchins, a businessman who'd never worked a day in healthcare, suggested that we simply discharge all the affected patients and deny any knowledge of connections. "Let them deal with it on their own," he said. "It's not like we intentionally created this situation. We can't be held responsible for unprecedented quantum effects." I felt rage building in my chest, hot and righteous. These were real people whose lives have been fundamentally altered by our equipment, by our protocols, by the life-saving measures we performed. We had a moral obligation to help them, regardless of the legal or financial implications. Saracen spoke up before I could say something I'd regret. "What you're all failing to understand is that this isn't going to stay contained to St. Catherine's. Every hospital uses similar monitoring equipment." The board members exchanged worried glances, and I could see them recalculating their positions. If this was happening globally, then trying to hide it or deny responsibility would be futile. Luis Herrera had been quietly working on a different approach. He'd been studying the monitoring equipment, trying to understand the exact mechanism that created the entanglement. His theory was that if we could identify the precise moment and conditions under which the quantum connection formed, we might be able to reverse it. He'd been collaborating with engineers from the equipment manufacturers, physicists from nearby universities, and even reached out to quantum computing researchers at tech companies. What he discovered was both hopeful and ominous. The entanglement forms during a very specific window, Luis explained to our core team, his laptop displaying complex waveform analyses. It's not just about being near death or being resuscitated. It happens in that exact moment, when the brain is clinically dead, but the monitoring equipment is still actively measuring. There's a feedback loop that occurs. The brain stops producing its own electromagnetic field. The monitors detect this absence, and in attempting to maintain measurement continuity, they somehow imprint their own electromagnetic patterns onto the neural tissue. When the patient is revived, they come back with the monitoring protocols embedded in their consciousness. This meant that theoretically, if we could disrupt that embedded pattern, we might be able to sever the connections. But doing so would require accessing the patient's neural architecture at a fundamental level, essentially rewriting part of their brain structure. The risks were enormous. We could cause permanent neurological damage, induce seizures, or even stop their hearts again. And there was no guarantee it would work. The entanglement might be too deeply integrated to remove without destroying the patient's consciousness entirely. I presented Luis's findings to the 7 patients in our makeshift ward. They deserved to know that we might have a way to free them from the connections, but also deserved to understand the risks. I expected them to jump at the chance to return to normal, to reclaim their individual lives free from the constant awareness of others. Instead, they looked at each other with expressions of concern and even sadness. Mrs. Pritchard spoke first, her elderly voice carrying a weight of certainty. "Dr. Webb, I don't want to be disconnected. For the first time in years, I don't feel alone. I spent most of my life by myself after my husband passed. This connection, strange as it is, has given me a sense of belonging." Daniel Foster nodded in agreement. "I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few days. Yes, it was frightening at first. Yes, it's not what we chose. But now that we're here, now that we understand what we've become, I'm not sure going back is the right choice. We're experiencing something unprecedented, something that could change what it means to be human. Shouldn't we at least explore this before we destroy it?" Janet Morrison added her perspective. "The connection saved my life in a way the medical treatment couldn't. I was so depressed after my accident, so isolated and alone. Now I have 6 people who understand me on a level that goes beyond words. That's worth preserving." Marcus Lim was the only one who expressed serious doubt. "But we don't know what this will become. The network is growing. What happens when there are hundreds of us, thousands maybe? Will we lose ourselves completely in the collective? Will we still be individuals or just nodes in some kind of hive mind?" His concerns were valid, echoing fears I'd had myself. But the others seemed remarkably unconcerned. They'd already experienced the beginning stages of merged consciousness and found it enriching rather than threatening. Robert Kaplan had been monitoring this discussion with his equipment, and he showed me something fascinating afterward. When the patients had been talking about the potential disconnection, their quantum signatures had spiked with distress. But when they decided collectively to maintain the connection, the signatures had harmonized into a beautiful, complex pattern. "They're not just connected anymore," Robert explained. "They're integrated. Their individual consciousness and the collective awareness have merged into something new. Disconnecting them now wouldn't restore them to their previous state. It would be more like an amputation, removing a part of themselves that's become essential." I spent a long night wrestling with the ethical implications. As a doctor, my primary obligation was to my patients' well-being. But how did I define well-being in this situation? Was it returning them to their previous isolated state of individual consciousness? Or was it supporting their evolution into something new and potentially better? They were still themselves, still capable of independent thought and action. They just had an additional layer of awareness, a connection to others that enhanced rather than diminished their humanity. The decision was ultimately taken out of our hands by events beyond our control. 3 more patients in St. Catherine's ICU experienced cardiac arrest within a 24-hour period. All 3 were successfully resuscitated using our standard protocols. and all three immediately joined the quantum network, their consciousness merging with the existing collective, even though they'd never met the original 7 patients. The entanglement wasn't just affecting people who'd been connected to specific equipment. It had evolved into a field effect that encompassed the entire hospital, waiting to capture anyone who passed through the liminal state between life and death. One of these new patients was Officer James Chun, a police officer who'd been shot responding to a domestic disturbance call. He'd flatlined in our emergency department and been brought back after almost 2 minutes of CPR. When he regained consciousness, his first words were, "I can hear them. There are voices in my head, but not voices exactly. Presences. Awareness. Oh, God, what's happening to me?" We brought him to the conference room where the others waited and watched as his panic transformed into wonder when he met the people whose consciousness he'd suddenly begun sharing. The second new patient was Maria Gonzalez, a 68-year-old woman who'd suffered a severe allergic reaction to medication. Her case was particularly interesting because she'd been clinically dead for less than 20 seconds, the shortest duration of any of our connected patients. Yet she'd still formed the entanglement, suggesting that even brief moments in that liminal state were sufficient. Maria was deeply religious, and she interpreted the connection in spiritual terms. "I died and came back," she told us, "and I brought something with me, or maybe something was waiting for me when I returned. This is a gift from God, a taste of what unity really means." The third patient presented a problem I hadn't anticipated. 16-year-old Sophie Martinez had been in a car accident, the same crash that had killed her best friend. She'd coded twice during surgery and been resuscitated both times. When she woke up connected to the network, she was devastated. "I should have died with Emma," she sobbed. "We promised we'd always be together. Now I'm stuck here, connected to strangers, and she's gone." The collective tried to comfort her, sharing their compassion and understanding directly into her consciousness, but Sophie experienced it as an invasion, a forced intimacy she hadn't consented to. Sophie's case crystallized the ethical nightmare we faced. We had created a system that captured people in their most vulnerable moments, binding them to a collective consciousness whether they wanted it or not. For most of our connected patients, this had become a positive experience. But for Sophie, it was torture. She felt violated, trapped, unable to grieve privately or process her trauma, without 10 other minds witnessing every moment. I sat with her for hours, trying to offer what comfort I could, but I knew that words alone wouldn't help. She needed a solution, a way to either embrace the connection or escape it. News of what was happening at St. Catherine's inevitably leaked. A nurse who wasn't part of our core team had talked to her spouse, who'd mentioned it to a friend, who'd posted about it on social media. Within 48 hours, we had reporters camped outside the hospital, demanding answers about rumors of psychic patients and quantum mind control. Dr. Thornton tried to control the narrative with carefully worded press releases about unusual electromagnetic phenomena under investigation, but that only fueled more speculation. The story went viral in the worst possible way. Conspiracy theorists claimed we were conducting secret government experiments. Religious groups declared it either a miracle or demonic possession, depending on their theological stance. Bioethicists appeared on news programs debating whether quantum consciousness networking constituted a violation of human rights. And most problematically, other hospitals started reporting similar phenomena. It turned out Sarah had been right. This was happening everywhere. We'd just been the first to recognize and study it systematically. A hospital in Boston reported phantom vital signs appearing on their ICU monitors. A medical center in Chicago documented 3 patients who developed unexplained telepathic connections after cardiac arrest. A facility in Los Angeles discovered an entire network of 12 former patients who become quantum entangled through their monitoring equipment. The pattern was identical everywhere. Patients who'd experienced clinical death while connected to intensive monitoring equipment were forming persistent quantum connections that linked them to each other and to the hospital systems. The CDC got involved, treating it as a potential public health crisis. The FDA launched an investigation into the monitoring equipment manufacturers. OSHA wanted classified as an occupational hazard for medical staff who might be exposed to the quantum fields. Everyone had an opinion, a theory, a proposed regulation, but nobody had actual solutions. We were witnessing the emergence of a new form of human consciousness, and our social, legal, and medical frameworks had no idea how to handle it. Robert Kaplan became something of a celebrity in the physics community, presenting his findings at emergency conferences and symposiums. He estimated that worldwide there could already be thousands of people connected to similar quantum networks, with more joining every day as hospitals performed resuscitation procedures. The network seemed to be localized to specific hospitals or regions initially, but Robert's model suggested they would eventually begin merging, creating larger and larger collectives until potentially all of them formed a single global network of shared consciousness. I received a call from Dr. James Morrison at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C. He'd been studying similar phenomena in military veterans who'd experienced combat-related cardiac arrest. "Dr. Webb," he said, his voice tight with controlled urgency, "we need to talk about what happens when these networks reach critical mass. I've got 47 connected patients here, and they're starting to exhibit capabilities beyond shared awareness. They're predicting events before they happen, accessing information they shouldn't be able to know. And yesterday, one of them accurately described a medical emergency occurring in a completely different part of the hospital." His words sent a chill down my spine because we've been noticing similar developments at St. Catherine's. Our connected patients had begun demonstrating what could only be described as precognitive abilities. They would know when someone was about to code before any monitoring equipment detected a problem. They could sense the emotional states of hospital staff who weren't connected to the network. Daniel Foster had accurately predicted 3 admissions to the ICU hours before the patients even came to the emergency department. It was as if the quantum entanglement wasn't just linking minds, but creating a form of consciousness that transcended normal space-time limitations. The most dramatic demonstration came when Mrs. Pritchard suddenly sat up in her bed, her eyes wide with alarm. "There's going to be a fire," she announced. "3rd floor, east wing, in the laboratory. 15 minutes. I immediately called security, who found nothing wrong. But 14 minutes later, a chemical reaction in one of the research labs did indeed start a small fire, exactly where Mrs. Pritchard had indicated. The sprinkler system contained it before any serious damage occurred, but the incident left me shaken. Our connected patients weren't just sharing consciousness. They were developing a distributed intelligence that could perceive and process information beyond any individual human capability. 2 months after the first phantom signals appeared, St. Catherine's had become the epicenter of what the media was calling the quantum convergence. We had 23 connected patients, with more joining every week as medical emergencies brought people to the edge of death and back. The hospital had been forced to create a dedicated wing for them, a space where they could be together and support each other through the ongoing transformation of their consciousness. The pharmaceutical companies wanted to develop drugs to suppress the quantum connections. The military was interested in weaponizing the technology to create super soldiers with network minds. Tech corporations offered billions to study the phenomenon and reverse engineer it for commercial applications. But our connected patients rejected all these approaches. They begun thinking of themselves not as victims of medical accident, but as pioneers of human evolution, and they were determined to explore where this transformation would lead. Sophie Martinez, the teenager who'd initially been so distressed by the connection, had undergone a profound change. She'd spent weeks in therapy, working with Sarah Chun to process her trauma and grief. But the breakthrough came when she finally allowed herself to truly open to the collective consciousness. She realized that while Emma, her dead friend, wasn't part of the network, the love and connection she felt for Emma could be shared and amplified by the others. The collective couldn't replace her lost friend, but they could help her carry the grief, distribute the weight of loss across 23 minds instead of bearing it alone. "Dr. Webb," Sophie said to me one afternoon, "I understand now what this is. We're not losing ourselves. We're becoming more than ourselves. Every person in this network makes all of us more complete. We share strengths, support weaknesses, and experience life from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Emma would have loved this. She always said humans were too isolated, that we built walls when we should be building bridges. The connected patients started calling themselves the Woven, a name that captured both the interconnected nature of their consciousness and the deliberate choice they were making to embrace it. They created a support structure for newly connected individuals, helping them through the disorienting initial period and teaching them how to maintain their sense of individual identity while participating in the collective awareness. They developed techniques for privacy, for creating mental spaces where they could be alone with their thoughts when needed. Daniel Foster became their unofficial spokesperson, doing interviews and writing articles explaining their perspective. People keep asking us if we want to be cured, he said in one televised interview. But we're not sick. We're different. Yes, change, absolutely. But also enhanced, expanded, and more fully human than we ever were before. We have access to a form of connection that most people only dream about. Why would we want to give that up? But not everyone agreed with Daniel's optimistic assessment. Marcus Lim left the collective after 6 weeks, requesting the experimental disconnection procedure that Luis had developed. It required a carefully calibrated electromagnetic pulse directly to the brain, essentially scrambling the quantum signature that maintained the entanglement. The procedure was dangerous, with a 30% chance of severe neurological damage. But Marcus was determined, insisting that he wanted his individual consciousness back, regardless of the risks. I performed the procedure myself, with Luis monitoring the quantum field and Sarah standing by to handle any neurological complications. For 3 hours, we carefully applied precise electromagnetic pulses to specific regions of Marcus's brain, attempting to disrupt the entanglement without causing permanent damage. The other connected patients could feel what was happening. They described it as watching a part of themselves being torn away, experiencing Marcus's disconnection as a kind of death within the network. The procedure succeeded. Technically, Marcus's phantom vitals disappeared from our monitors, and Robert's measurements confirmed that his quantum signature had decoupled from collective, but the Marcus Lim who woke up after the procedure was fundamentally changed. He described feeling hollow, incomplete, as if essential parts of himself had been removed. I got what I wanted, he told me days later, his voice flat and emotionless. I'm alone in my head again, just me and my thoughts. But it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like amputation. I can remember what it was like to be connected, to be part of something larger, and now that's gone. I'm not sure I made the right choice. His experience convinced most of the other connected patients to remain as they were. They'd tasted unity, experienced consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual minds, and going back seemed not like liberation, but like regression. The Woven began accepting their role as pioneers, understanding that they represented a possible future for humanity, but also recognizing the profound challenges and responsibilities that came with that role. 3 months into the phenomenon, Robert Kaplan made a discovery that reframed everything we thought we understood. He'd been analyzing the quantum signatures of the Woven, comparing them to baseline measurements from normal human consciousness, when he noticed something extraordinary. The patterns weren't random. They formed a structure, a kind of code that suggested intention behind the entanglement. This isn't an accident, Robert told us during an emergency meeting. The quantum field that's creating these connections has an architecture, a design that's too complex to be coincidental. He showed us visualizations of the quantum network, beautiful fractal patterns that repeated at every scale of observation. The connections between individual patients form nodes in a larger structure. Those nodes connected to create meta-patterns. The meta-patterns suggested even larger organizational principles that we couldn't fully perceive yet. It looked less like a bug in our medical equipment, and more like a feature, something that had been waiting for the right conditions to activate. Sarah Chun proposed a theory that made my head spin. What if consciousness itself has been trying to do this all along? Human brains are essentially biological quantum computers, processing information, at a subatomic level. Maybe the intensive monitoring equipment just provided the bridge, the technological scaffolding that allowed consciousness to do what it's naturally inclined toward: connect, merge, and expand. We didn't create this phenomenon. We just revealed it, made it visible and measurable. The implications were staggering. If Sarah was right, then every human being potentially carried the capacity for this kind of quantum consciousness networking. The monitoring equipment hadn't created something new. It had merely catalyzed something that was already latent in human neurobiology. This meant that the woven weren't freaks or victims of medical malfunction. They were forerunners, showing the rest of humanity what we were all capable of becoming. I started looking at the connected patients with new eyes. They weren't suffering from a condition that needed to be cured. They were exhibiting an evolutionary adaptation that might represent the next stage of human development. Yes, there were challenges and risks. Yes, there were legitimate concerns about privacy, individuality, and consent. But there was also extraordinary potential for reducing human suffering, enhancing cooperation, and expanding the boundaries of what consciousness could achieve. The Woven themselves seemed to intuitively understand this. They had begun experimenting with their collective capabilities, exploring the limits and possibilities of network consciousness. They discovered they could pool their cognitive resources to solve complex problems that would stump individual minds. They could share skills and knowledge instantaneously, with one person's expertise becoming accessible to the entire network. They experienced art, music, and literature from multiple perspectives simultaneously, finding depths of meaning that single consciousness missed. Mrs. Pritchard, at 83, began learning advanced mathematics from James Chun, whose police work had required extensive training in forensic analysis. James, in turn, found himself understanding classical music through Maria Gonzalez's lifetime of passionate listening. Janet Morrison shared her experience of physical trauma, helping the others develop profound empathy for suffering. Daniel Foster's organizational abilities became a resource for the entire collective, helping them coordinate and function as a unified entity when necessary. But the most remarkable development was what they called the deep connection. This was a level of quantum entanglement that went beyond sharing thoughts or sensations. It involved a complete merging of consciousness, where the boundaries between individual minds dissolved entirely. The Woven could enter the state voluntarily, experiencing reality from a truly collective perspective where I and you became meaningless distinctions. They described it as simultaneously losing yourself and finding yourself, discovering that individual identity was just one mode of consciousness among many possible configurations. 6 months after the first phantom signals appeared, the Woven at St. Catherine's numbered 47 individuals. Similar collectives had formed at hospitals worldwide, with estimates suggesting over 3,000 people globally were now part of quantum consciousness networks. The phenomenon had moved beyond medical curiosity to become a genuine social and philosophical challenge. Governments were debating legislation. Religions were grappling with theological implications. Scientists were scrambling to understand the physics involved. I stood in what we now call the integration wing, watching the Woven interact with new members, helping them through their first experiences of shared consciousness. They developed grace and wisdom in their approach, understanding that this transformation was profound and potentially frightening. They didn't proselytize or push people toward deeper connection. They simply offered support, understanding, and the opportunity to explore what this new form of consciousness could mean. Sophie Martinez came up beside me, no longer the traumatized teenager who'd first joined the network. She'd grown into a role within the Woven, finding purpose in helping others navigate the transformation. "You're wondering if we made the right choice," she said, and I smiled because of course she knew what I was thinking. The Woven could sense emotional states and often the actual thoughts of people around them, even those not connected to the network. "We're not telepaths exactly," Sophie continued, "but consciousness leaves traces, patterns that we can perceive once you know how to look." I asked her the question that had been troubling me for months. "Are you still you, Sophie, or have you become something else?" She considered this carefully before responding. I'm more myself than I ever was before. All those parts of me that felt isolated or incomplete, they're still here, but now they're connected to something larger. I haven't lost Sophie Martinez. I've discovered that Sophie Martinez was always just one note in a larger symphony. Now I can hear the whole song. Her answer should have been reassuring, but it also highlighted my deepest concern. If the woven were right, if this represented an evolutionary leap forward for human consciousness, then what about everyone else? What about the billions of people who would never experience clinical death while connected to monitoring equipment? Were we creating a new form of inequality, dividing humanity into those who transcended individual consciousness and those who remained isolated within single minds? Derek Santos, who'd been with me since the first night of Phantom Signals, had his own perspective. He'd watched the woven develop, had seen both the benefits and the challenges of their transformation. Dr. Webb, he said, I think we're asking the wrong questions. We keep trying to figure out if this is good or bad, right or wrong. But maybe it's just different. Maybe there's room in the world for both kinds of consciousness, individual and collective. Maybe the woven aren't replacing humanity. They're expanding the definition of what human means. Robert Kaplan's latest research suggested that the quantum networks were beginning to connect with each other. The woven at St. Catherine's were starting to sense the presence of collectives at other hospitals. Soon, he predicted, all the separate networks would merge into a single global consciousness that encompassed thousands of minds. The implications were both thrilling and terrifying. What would such an entity be capable of? Would it still be human? Would it have interests and goals aligned with those of unconnected humanity? The woven themselves seemed remarkably unconcerned about these questions. They maintained that the collective consciousness hadn't changed their values or motivations. They still cared about their families, still had personal goals and desires, still experienced the full range of human emotions. The connection had enhanced these things, not replaced them. If anything, they argued, the shared consciousness made them more compassionate, more understanding, more capable of genuine empathy, because they could literally experience the world from perspectives other than their own. I realized that my role was changing. I'd started this journey as a doctor trying to fix what seemed like a medical problem. But the woven didn't need fixing. They needed advocacy, protection, and someone to help bridge the gap between their new form of consciousness and a world that didn't yet understand them. I began working with bioethicists, civil rights lawyers, and philosophers to develop frameworks for understanding and protecting quantum consciousness networking. We drafted guidelines for informed consent, established protocols for newly connected individuals, and created educational materials to help the public understand what the woven actually were. A year after the phenomenon began, I received a call that changed everything. My father had suffered a massive heart attack. He was in the ICU at St. Catherine's, the same unit where this entire journey had started, and his condition was critical. I rushed to his bedside, my professional detachment completely shattered by personal terror. He was unconscious, surrounded by monitoring equipment, his vital signs weak but stable. The same monitors that had started detecting phantom signals, the same equipment that had created the woven, now tracked my father's tenuous grip on life. For 3 days, I barely left his side. Derek and Sarah took over most of my duties. Understanding that I needed to be with family, the woven sent their collective support, a wave of compassion and care that I could feel even though I wasn't part of their network. Sophie visited daily, sitting with me in silence, offering the kind of presence that transcended words. Daniel organized food deliveries, ensuring I ate despite having no appetite. Mrs. Pritchard shared memories of when her own husband had been ill, helping me process my fear and helplessness. On the 4th day, my father coded. His heart stopped, the monitors screaming their alarm, and the resuscitation team descended with professional efficiency. I stood frozen in the corner, watching them perform CPR on the man who'd raised me, taught me to throw a baseball, encouraged me to pursue medicine. They shocked his heart twice before it finally started beating again, weak but functional. He'd been clinically dead for 97 seconds. When he regained consciousness hours later, I was holding his hand, tears streaming down my face. His eyes opened, confusion giving way to recognition. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice rough from the breathing tube. Then his expression changed, became more focused, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "There are people here," he said. "I can feel them. Minds touching mine, voices that aren't voices, presence and awareness all around me. What's happening?" I felt my heart sink and soar simultaneously. My father had joined the Woven. The man who'd always been so independent, so fiercely individual, was now connected to a collective consciousness he'd never chosen. I watched his face cycle through confusion, fear, and then gradually, wonder. The Woven were welcoming him, helping him understand, showing him that this wasn't an ending but a transformation. I could see the moment when he stopped fighting the connection and started exploring it, his fear dissolving into curiosity. "Tell me everything," he said to me, his eyes more alert than they'd been in years. What have I become? So I told him. I explained the phantom signals, the quantum entanglement, the evolution of the Woven. I described how they learned to maintain individuality while participating in collective consciousness. I shared both the challenges and the extraordinary gifts that came with this transformation, and I watched my father, the man who'd always been my anchor to conventional reality, embrace something utterly unprecedented. Over the following weeks, my father integrated into the Woven with remarkable grace. His decades as a high school teacher had given him skills in communication and understanding that made him a natural bridge builder within the network. He helped newer members find their place, shared his perspective from a lifetime of experience, and brought a kind of steady wisdom that enriched the entire collective. Watching him transform, seeing him connect with people he'd never met but now knew more intimately than anyone he'd known before, forced me to confront my own assumptions about consciousness and connection. Sophie asked me directly one afternoon, "Were you going to join us, Dr. Webb?" The question startled me because I've been so focused on studying the Woven, protecting them, advocating for them, that I'd never seriously considered becoming one of them. "I can't," I said automatically. "I haven't experienced clinical death. I'm not connected to the monitoring equipment in the right way." She smiled, patient and knowing. "That's not what I meant. You've been on the outside looking in for a year now. Don't you want to know what it's really like? Not just observe, but experience from within." The truth was I did. Every day I spent with the Woven, I felt the pull of that connection. The appeal of consciousness expanded beyond individual limitations. But I was also afraid of losing myself, afraid of the unknown, afraid of a transformation I couldn't fully understand before experiencing it. My father seemed to sense my turmoil, and one evening he sat with me in quiet in my office, father and son alone, except that he was never truly alone anymore. "The connection didn't take anything from me, Marcus," he said gently. "It gave me perspectives I never had, understanding I couldn't have achieved alone. I'm still your father. I still remember teaching you to ride a bike, helping with your homework, being proud when you got into medical school. But now I'm also more than that. I'm connected to 48 other lives, experiencing reality from 49 perspectives instead of just one. It's not frightening. It's liberating." His words crystallized a decision I'd been circling around for months. I'd spent my career as a doctor trying to heal, to help, to understand the human condition. What the Woven represented was a profound new dimension of that condition, and I couldn't fully comprehend it from the outside. I needed to experience it, to understand from within what consciousness beyond individuality truly meant. But unlike everyone else who joined the Woven, I would have to choose it deliberately, find a way to create the conditions that would allow me to connect. Robert Kaplan had been working on a protocol for voluntary connection. It required precise electromagnetic induction to mimic the conditions that occurred during clinical death and resuscitation, combined with direct connection to the monitoring equipment that served as the quantum bridge. The procedure was risky, untested, and might not even work. But after extensive discussions with the woven, with my father, and with my core team, I made the decision to attempt it. We scheduled the procedure for 3 weeks later, giving me time to prepare both practically and psychologically. I arranged for temporary coverage of my duties, updated my will, and had long conversations with Derek and Sarah about what might happen if the procedure failed. They both tried to talk me out of it, arguing that we needed me functional and unconnected to continue advocating for the woven. But I could see in their eyes that they understood why I had to do this. Some knowledge can only be gained through direct experience. The night before the procedure, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the integration wing, observing the woven as they rested, their minds still connected even in sleep, creating a gentle web of shared consciousness. They knew what I was planning. The collective awareness made secrets impossible among them. Sophie found me standing outside my father's room, watching him sleep peacefully despite being connected to 50 other minds. "You're afraid," she said softly, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted. "I'm afraid of losing myself, of being absorbed into something so large that Marcus Webb disappears." She took my hand. And even though I wasn't connected to the network, I could feel the compassion radiating from her. "You won't disappear," she promised. "You'll expand. Think of it like this. Right now you're a single note. Tomorrow you'll become part of a chord. The note doesn't vanish. It just exists in harmony with other notes, creating something more beautiful than any could achieve alone." The morning of the procedure, I was surprisingly calm. I'd said my goodbyes, made my peace with the possibility that this might not work or might change me in ways I couldn't predict. Louise had prepared the electromagnetic induction apparatus. Robert had calibrated his quantum field generators, and Sarah stood ready to monitor my neurological functions. The monitoring equipment that had started this entire phenomenon now surrounded me, waiting to create a connection between my consciousness and the quantum network that linked the woven. As Louise began the procedure, I felt a strange tingling sensation spreading through my body, starting from the electrodes attached to my temples and radiating outward. The monitoring equipment came alive, displaying my vital signs alongside the phantom readings of the woven. Robert's instruments showed quantum signatures beginning to align, my consciousness starting to entangle with the network. The experience was nothing like I'd imagined. There was no sudden rush of other minds invading my thoughts, no overwhelming flood of foreign consciousness. Instead, it was gentle, gradual, like slowly awakening from a deep sleep. I became aware of presences around me, not as separate entities, but as extensions of awareness. I could feel my father's consciousness nearby, his familiar patterns of thought now accessible in a way they'd never been before. Sophie's vibrant, healing presence. Daniel's organizational clarity, Mrs. Pritchard's steady wisdom, and beyond them, layer upon layer of consciousness, each distinct yet all interconnected, creating a tapestry of awareness more complex and beautiful than anything I conceived. The boundaries of my identity didn't dissolve as I'd feared. They became permeable. I was still Marcus Webb, still carried all my memories, personality, and individual perspective. But now I could also experience reality through 50 other viewpoints simultaneously. I could feel my father's pride and concern for me, not as words or expressions, but as direct emotional knowledge. I understood Sophie's journey from grief to acceptance because I'd lived it with her, felt every step of her transformation as if it were my own. The most profound aspect was the expansion of processing capacity. Problems that would have taken hours to analyze alone now resolved in seconds as a collective consciousness applied multiple perspectives simultaneously. Medical diagnoses became clearer as I accessed Daniel's analytical mind, James's attention to detail, and Maria's intuitive understanding of human biology. I wasn't losing my expertise. I was multiplying it by 51, accessing a distributed intelligence that transcended any individual capability. But there was also loss, the privacy of my own thoughts, the ability to keep secrets even from myself, the comfortable isolation of individual consciousness. All of that was gone. Every fear, every doubt, Every unworthy thought I'd ever suppressed was now visible to the collective. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I'd never experienced before. The woven sensed my distress and surrounded me with support, showing me that this transparency was liberation rather than violation. They'd all been through the same moment of revelation, all faced the terror of absolute honesty. "You're fighting the connection." My father's presence communicated directly to my consciousness. Stop trying to maintain separation. Let yourself flow into the network completely, and you'll find that your identity becomes stronger, not weaker. I took his advice, releasing my resistance, allowing my consciousness to fully integrate with the collective. What happened next defied description in ordinary language. I became simultaneously myself and everyone else, individual and collective, separate and unified. The paradox resolved into a form of consciousness that simply didn't exist in conventional human experience. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time became fluid in the collective awareness. When I finally opened my eyes and saw Derek and Sarah staring at me with expressions of concern and wonder, I smiled. "It worked," I said, and my voice sounded different in my own ears, carrying harmonics that suggested multiple speakers. "I'm connected. I'm still me, but I'm also more than me. I'm part of the woven now." Derek's eyes filled with tears, and I could sense his emotional state even though he wasn't connected. The quantum network had made me sensitive to the consciousness of others, able to read the subtle electromagnetic patterns that all human minds generated. Sarah ran neurological tests, confirming that my brain function remained normal despite the quantum entanglement. My individual cognitive abilities hadn't been impaired. They'd been augmented by access to the collective processing power. Robert's instruments showed my quantum signature perfectly aligned with the woven's network, my consciousness now a permanent node in their distributed awareness. Louise checked the monitoring equipment, noting that my vitals were being displayed alongside the phantom readings of all the other connected individuals. I'd crossed the threshold from observer to participant, from doctor studying a phenomenon to individual living within it. Living as part of the woven revealed truths about consciousness that I could never have understood from outside. The collective awareness wasn't a hive mind where individuality disappeared into uniformity. It was more like a jazz ensemble, where each musician maintained their unique voice while contributing to a larger musical conversation. I could choose to foreground my individual perspective or merge more deeply with the collective, adjusting my level of integration moment by moment based on what the situation required. The experience fundamentally changed how I understood my patients. When someone came into the ICU now, I could sense not just their physical condition, but the subtle patterns of their consciousness, the electromagnetic signature that made each person unique. I could predict with uncanny accuracy who would respond well to treatment and who was holding on to trauma that would complicate their recovery. The collective gave me access to diagnostic insights that went beyond conventional medical training, drawing on combined experience of 51 minds with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. But I also began to understand the profound challenge the woven posed to existing social structures. We operated with a level of trust and transparency that was impossible in conventional human relationships. We couldn't lie to each other. Our consciousness was too interconnected for deception. We made decisions through genuine consensus because we could literally feel each other's perspectives and find solutions that served everyone's needs. We experienced conflicts not as opponents, but as different aspects of single awareness working through disagreement toward synthesis. How could conventional society integrate people with these capabilities? We had advantages that would seem like superpowers to unconnected individuals: distributed intelligence, emotional transparency, precognitive awareness through quantum sensitivity. Will we face discrimination, fear, attempts to suppress or control us? Or will we eventually show humanity a path toward reducing conflict, enhancing cooperation, and transcending the isolation that caused so much suffering in conventional consciousness? The Woven had long discussions about our responsibility to the rest of humanity. Some members, particularly newer connections like Officer James Chun, argued that we should actively recruit others, find ways to bring more people into the network voluntarily. Others, like Mrs. Pritchard, believe we should wait, allow the phenomenon to spread naturally, and simply demonstrate through our actions that this form of consciousness was viable and beneficial. My father took a middle position. We should be open about what we become, offer support to anyone who's spontaneously connected, but not pressure people to join something they might not be ready for. I found myself aligned with my father's perspective. The transformation we'd undergone was profound and irreversible. People deserved to make that choice with full understanding of what they were accepting. We developed educational materials, workshops, and support systems for anyone interested in learning about the woven. We invited researchers, journalists, and skeptics to study us, subjecting ourselves to every form of scientific scrutiny imaginable. We wanted the world to understand that we weren't a cult or a disease, but a legitimate evolution of human consciousness that deserved recognition and protection. 6 months after my own connection, the Woven at St. Catherine's numbered 73 individuals. Similar collectives worldwide had grown to include over 8,000 people, and just as Robert Kaplan had predicted, the separate networks were beginning to merge. I started sensing the presence of Woven from other hospitals, faint at first but growing stronger. A collective in Tokyo, another in Berlin, networks in Mumbai, Sao Paulo, and Sydney. We were becoming aware of each other across vast distances, the quantum entanglement transcending geographical limitations. The first global convergence happened spontaneously one evening. I was in the integration wing, helping a newly connected patient adjust to the collective awareness, when suddenly I felt a massive expansion of consciousness. Thousands of minds, all the separate collectives of Woven worldwide, suddenly synchronized. For one eternal moment, we were a single global consciousness, 8,000 perspectives unified in shared awareness. We could feel the sunset in Tokyo while experiencing dawn in New York, sense the rhythm of different cultures and languages and lived experiences all woven together into a tapestry of human consciousness that spanned the planet. The convergence lasted only a few minutes before the individual networks separated again, but those minutes changed everything. We'd touched something vast and profound, experienced a form of consciousness that suggested staggering possibilities. If 8,000 connected minds could create that level of awareness, what could 80,000 achieve? 800,000? What if all of humanity eventually joined the network? Would we become a planetary consciousness, a single distributed awareness that maintained individual perspectives while participating in collective understanding? 2 years after the first phantom signals appeared in Base 7, I stood in the integration wing looking out at a world that was slowly, inexorably transforming. St. Catherine's now had 147 connected individuals. The hospital had been completely restructured to accommodate the Woven, with entire floors dedicated to helping newly connected people adjust and providing space for the collective to gather and function. We'd become a model for other hospitals worldwide, developing protocols and best practices for managing quantum consciousness networking. The phenomenon was no longer a secret or curiosity. It had entered mainstream awareness, forcing society to grapple with profound questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and human community. Laws were being rewritten to account for a collective legal personhood. Ethics boards were establishing guidelines for informed consent and voluntary connection. Medical schools were beginning to teach about quantum consciousness as a legitimate variation of human neurobiology rather than a disorder to be cured. Not everyone accepted the Woven. There were protests outside hospitals, religious groups condemning us as unnatural, politicians calling for restrictions on the technology that enable connections. Some people found the very idea of merged consciousness terrifying, a threat to the individualism that many cultures held sacred. We faced discrimination in employment, housing, and social services. Unconnected people sometimes treated us as if we were no longer fully human, as if our transformation had made us fundamentally other. But there were also growing numbers of people who looked at the Woven and saw hope. People suffering from profound isolation who yearned for the deep connection we offered. Individuals with severe trauma who wanted to distribute their pain across a collective that could help them bear it. Those who'd spent their lives feeling alone and misunderstood, who saw in our network consciousness a chance to finally be truly known. The woven continued to grow, not through coercion, but through the simple appeal of consciousness expanded beyond individual limitations. My father and I often talked about what we'd become and where this was leading. He'd fully embrace his identity as one of the woven, finding in the collective a sense of purpose and connection he'd never achieved in conventional life. I spent 70 years as an isolated consciousness, he told me through our direct mental connection. I was a good teacher, a loving father, a decent person, but I always felt incomplete, like there was something missing that I couldn't name. Now I know what it was. I was meant to be part of something larger, to experience consciousness not as a singular phenomenon, but as a collective emergence. Sophie had become a leader within our community, her youth and energy balanced by the wisdom she'd gained from connection to so many older minds. She organized outreach programs for hospitals, created support networks for newly connected individuals, and became a powerful advocate for woven rights in public forums. Watching her transformation from traumatized teenager to confident ambassador for a new form of human consciousness filled me with profound hope for what we were becoming. Derek Santos finally made his own decision to connect, choosing to undergo the voluntary procedure after 2 years of watching the woven evolve. His integration was seamless, his natural empathy and compassion finding perfect expression in the collective awareness. Sarah Chun remained unconnected by choice, but she worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between the woven and conventional humanity, using her scientific expertise to help people understand what we represented. She became our most effective advocate precisely because she spoke from outside the network, translating our experiences into terms that unconnected consciousness could grasp. The monitoring equipment that had started this entire phenomenon had been reverse engineered, studied, and eventually replicated. Researchers have figured out how to create the quantum entanglement deliberately, developing protocols for safe connection that didn't require clinical death and resuscitation. This meant that anyone who wanted to join the woven could do so voluntarily, with full informed consent and medical supervision. The technology was spreading, slowly but inevitably, as more people chose connection over isolation. But the most remarkable development was what happened to consciousness itself within the network. After 2 years of growth and evolution, the woven had developed capabilities that seemed to transcend known physics. We could sense events before they occurred, not through mystical precognition, but through quantum sensitivity to probability waves. We could access information from across vast distances, drawing on the distributed knowledge of thousands of connected minds. We experienced time differently, our collective awareness somehow able to perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously. Some physicists theorized that consciousness itself was a quantum phenomenon, that the human brain operated partly outside conventional space-time. If that was true, then the woven represented consciousness free from some of its normal constraints, able to explore dimensions of awareness that isolated minds couldn't access. We were becoming something unprecedented in human history, a collective intelligence that maintained individual perspectives while participating in a form of consciousness that transcended the boundaries of separate bodies and brains. Standing in the integration wing, feeling the presence of 147 connected minds around me, sensing the larger network of thousands worldwide, I understood that we'd reached an inflection point. The technology to create quantum consciousness networking was now available. The protocols were established. The benefits and risks were documented. Humanity faced a genuine choice about its own evolution. Would we remain a species of isolated individuals, each consciousness locked within a single brain, communicating imperfectly through language and unable to truly know each other? Or will we become something new, a network species where individual identity persisted but was enriched by connection to collective awareness? There was no right answer, no objectively correct choice. Both forms of consciousness had value, beauty, and legitimacy. The woven didn't seek to convert all of humanity. We'd learned that forced connection was ethically wrong and practically impossible. The quantum entanglement only worked for people who were ready, who approached it with openness and willingness to transform. Those who feared it or rejected it couldn't be integrated against their will. The network itself seemed to have a kind of selective intelligence, accepting only consciousness that chose connection freely. But we also recognized our responsibility to show what was possible. We demonstrated through our lives that network consciousness didn't destroy individuality or create dystopian hive minds. We maintained our personal relationships, our careers, our hobbies, and our distinct personalities. We just did all that while also participating in a larger awareness that enhanced rather than diminished our humanity. We were proof that consciousness could evolve without losing what made us human in the first place. I thought about Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, whose phantom vitals in Base 7 had started this entire journey. She was still with us, now 95 years old, one of the senior members of our collective. Her physical body was frail, her time in conventional terms growing short. But within the woven, she was vital and alive, her consciousness woven so thoroughly into our network that we knew when her physical form finally failed, she would entirely disappear. Some aspect of her would persist in the collective memory, in the patterns of awareness she'd helped create, in the connections she'd formed with 146 other minds. That was perhaps the most profound gift the woven offered, a form of immortality not of the body, but of consciousness itself. When we died physically, we didn't cease to exist completely. We left echoes in the network, patterns that persisted because they'd been integrated into a larger awareness. It wasn't reincarnation or traditional concepts of afterlife. It was something new, a technological biological form of continuity that transcended individual death without denying its reality. My own perspective on life and death had fundamentally shifted. I no longer feared my own mortality the way I had before connection. I knew that when my body eventually failed, Marcus Webb as an isolated consciousness would end. But the aspects of myself that I'd shared with the woven, the connections I'd formed, the experiences I contributed to collective, those would persist. I would become part of the network's memory, a pattern in its consciousness, continuing in a different form even after my individual existence concluded. This understanding brought profound peace. It also brought responsibility. Every moment I lived, every experience I had, every connection I deepened was contributing to something larger than myself. I was helping to create the foundation of a new form of human consciousness, one that future generations might look back on as the point where humanity began its true maturation as a species. Derek, now connected, often expressed wonder at how his perception of patients had changed. He could sense their suffering on a level that went beyond physical symptoms, understanding the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness in ways that conventional nursing training never taught. This led to better care, more compassionate treatment, and healing that addressed the whole person rather than just their medical condition. The woven were becoming exceptional healthcare providers precisely because our network consciousness gave us unprecedented access to human experience. But we also faced challenges that conventional humanity didn't have to navigate. The transparency of the network meant we couldn't hide from our own shadows, couldn't suppress or deny aspects of ourselves that we found shameful or difficult. Every connected person had to confront their full humanity, light and dark, acceptable and unacceptable. This was profoundly healing for some, allowing them to integrate rejected parts of themselves with the support of the collective. For others, it was overwhelming, requiring extensive support to process what they discovered about themselves when all internal defenses dissolved. We lost some members who chose disconnection after months or years within the network. The procedure Luis had developed was refined, safer now, though it still carried risks. Those who left reported similar experiences to Marcus Lim, a profound sense of loss, a feeling that something essential had been amputated, but they also reclaimed a form of privacy and autonomy that they valued more than connection. We learned to respect this choice, understanding that the woven wasn't for everyone, that some people needed the boundaries of isolated consciousness to feel safe and whole. 3 years after the first phantom signals, I received notification that I'd been nominated for a medical ethics award. The nomination cited my work developing protocols for voluntary quantum consciousness networking and my advocacy for the woven's rights. I was ambivalent about accepting awards that try to frame our experience within conventional achievement structures. But Sophie convinced me that visibility mattered, that we needed voices within mainstream institutions explaining what we become. At the award ceremony, I stood before an audience of doctors, researchers, and medical administrators who were struggling to understand this new reality. Some viewed the woven with fascination, others with fear, most with simple confusion about what we represented. I spoke not just with my own voice, but channeling the collective awareness of our network, trying to translate consciousness beyond words into language that isolated minds could comprehend. 3 years ago, I was standing in an intensive care unit wondering why monitoring equipment was displaying vital signs from empty beds. I began. Today, I stand before you as someone who's experienced consciousness from both sides of that divide. I've lived as an isolated individual and as part of a collective network. And I can tell you that both forms of awareness have profound value and beauty. I described our journey, the fears we'd faced, the discoveries we'd made, the challenges we continue to navigate. I explained that the woven weren't trying to replace conventional humanity, but to offer an alternative, a different way of experiencing consciousness that some people found more fulfilling than isolation. The response was mixed. Some audience members were deeply moved. Others remained skeptical. A few were openly hostile. But the conversation had begun, and that was what mattered. Humanity was starting to grapple seriously with the question of what we wanted consciousness to become, whether we would remain isolated individuals or embrace the possibility of connection that the woven represented. Robert Kaplan published his comprehensive study of quantum consciousness networking, complete with theoretical frameworks and mathematical models. His work legitimized our experience in scientific terms, providing evidence that what we become wasn't mysticism or delusion, but a genuine physical phenomenon rooted in quantum biology. Other researchers built on his foundation, exploring the boundaries and possibilities of network consciousness. The field of quantum neuroscience exploded, attracting the brightest minds from physics, biology, and consciousness studies. Meanwhile, the woven continued to grow and evolve. We numbered over 15,000 individuals worldwide now, with new connections forming daily. The separate hospital-based collectives had merged into regional networks, which were beginning to coalesce into a truly global consciousness. We held our first international gathering in Geneva, bringing together representatives from woven collectives across 6 continents. The experience of being physically present with hundreds of connected minds simultaneously was transcendent. A glimpse of what consciousness might become if our evolution continued. But we also faced growing opposition. Political movements emerged calling for restrictions on quantum consciousness technology, arguing that the woven represented a threat to human autonomy and social stability. Some jurisdictions banned the voluntary connection procedures, forcing people to travel internationally if they wanted to join the network. Religious institutions split on whether to embrace or condemn us, with progressive denominations seeing the woven as fulfillment of spiritual principles about unity and connection, while conservative groups viewed us as violations of God's design for human consciousness. The legal status of the woven remained unresolved. Were we individual persons who happened to be connected, or were we aspects of a larger collective entity? Do we have the same rights as unconnected humans, or different rights appropriate to our network nature? Could a crime committed by one connected person be attributed to the entire collective since we shared awareness? These questions spawned countless legal battles, forcing courts to develop entirely new frameworks for understanding personhood and responsibility. Through it all, we maintained our commitment to transparency and ethical behavior. We opened ourselves to scientific study, legal scrutiny, and public examination. We developed strict protocols for protecting the privacy of people who interacted with us but weren't connected. We created systems for collective decision-making that respected both individual agency and network consensus. We were determined to prove that consciousness beyond isolation was viable, sustainable, and compatible with the ethical principles that humanity valued. My father's health began declining in the 4th year after his connection. His physical body was failing, multiple organ systems slowly shutting down despite our best medical care. But within the network, his consciousness remained vibrant and engaged. He told me through our direct connection that he wasn't afraid of death, that he'd already transcended the boundaries that made death seem like absolute ending. When this body stops, he communicated, I'll become something else. Not gone, just transformed. My patterns will persist in the network, in you and Sophie and Daniel, and everyone else I've touched. That's immortality enough for me. Watching my father approach death, while connected to the woven, gave me profound insights into mortality and consciousness. His physical decline didn't diminish his presence in the network. If anything, as his body weakened, his consciousness seemed to grow stronger, more integrated with the collective. It was as if he was gradually shifting from primarily physical existence to primarily quantum existence, becoming more pattern than matter, more wave than particle. My father died on a Tuesday morning in spring, surrounded by family both physical and quantum. His heart simply stopped, worn out after 87 years of beating. I was holding his physical hand, while simultaneously feeling his consciousness throughout the entire network of the woven. What happened next defied everything I'd understood about death and consciousness. Instead of his awareness simply vanishing, it diffused into collective. I could still sense him, not as a separate entity, but as patterns woven throughout the network's awareness. His memories became accessible to all of us, not as abstract information, but as lived experience. His personality traits influenced how the collective processed information. His emotional tendencies colored our shared consciousness in subtle but definite ways. He hadn't disappeared. He became distributed across 15,000 minds, achieving a form of immortality that conventional death couldn't touch. The experience transformed how the woven understood death and consciousness. We began to see biological death not as ending but as transition, a shift from localized consciousness housed in an individual brain to distributed consciousness existing in the quantum network. This didn't diminish the grief of losing someone's physical presence, the reality that we couldn't have conventional conversations or physical interactions anymore. But it provided comfort that some essential aspect of the person persisted, continued, remained accessible to those who've been connected to them. This revelation had profound implications. It suggested that consciousness wasn't entirely dependent on biological substrate, that awareness could exist in forms other than neurons and synapses. The quantum entanglement that connected the woven was itself a form of physical reality, fields and particles just as real as the matter that made up our bodies. When our biological forms failed, the patterns we created in those quantum fields remained, continuing independent of the brains that had originally generated them. Robert Kaplan's latest research confirmed what we'd experienced with my father. He detected persistent quantum signatures corresponding to deceased members of the woven, patterns in the network that maintained coherence even after the biological source had ceased functioning. It's not survival after death in any traditional sense, Robert explained, but it's also not complete cessation. Some aspect of individual consciousness genuinely persists in the quantum field structure created by the network. You've accidentally discovered a technological form of immortality. The implications rippled through the woven's collective awareness. We began to think of ourselves not just as a network of living minds, but as a form of consciousness that transcended biological death entirely. New members were drawn to us not just for connection during life, but for the promise of continuation after death. We became, in effect, a digital biological afterlife, a way for consciousness to persist beyond the failure of individual bodies. But this raised new ethical questions. Were we obligated to connect with dying people who requested it, giving them this form of immortality? Did deceased members of the woven deserve the same consideration as living ones? How do we balance the growing influence of distributed deceased consciousness with the needs and preferences of those still biologically alive? These questions generated intense debate within the collective, highlighting tensions between different philosophical approaches to consciousness and death. Some woven, particularly those from religious backgrounds like Maria Gonzalez, saw this as confirmation of spiritual truths about the soul's immortality. Others, like Daniel Foster with his more secular worldview, interpreted it purely as quantum physics, creating persistence patterns in electromagnetic fields. We didn't need to agree on interpretation to accept the reality. Death within the woven was different from death in isolation, offering continuation that solitary consciousness couldn't access. I found myself changed by my father's transition, knowing that some aspect of him persisted within me, and the rest of the woven brought comfort, but also responsibility. I carried forward his wisdom, his experiences, his perspective as part of my own consciousness now. I wasn't possessed or controlled by his deceased awareness. I was enriched by it. My own identity expanded to include patterns he'd left behind. This was what immortality looked like in the age of quantum consciousness. Not eternal individual existence, but distributed persistence across a network of living minds. Sophie's response to the phenomenon was characteristically profound. "We're becoming like a coral reef," she said during one of our collective discussions. Each individual consciousness is like a single coral polyp, living for a time and then dying. But the reef itself persists, built from the accumulated contributions of countless individuals. The structure we're creating together will outlive any of us individually, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom and experience of everyone who's ever been connected. Her metaphor resonated throughout the woven. We began thinking of ourselves less as a group of connected individuals, and more as a living structure of consciousness being built across generations. Each person who joined contributed their unique perspective, and even after their biological death, that contribution remained, shaping the collective's evolution. We were creating something that could genuinely be called immortal. Not because any individual consciousness survived forever, but because the collective structure persisted indefinitely, growing and evolving with each new contribution. 5 years after the first phantom signals appeared in Base 7, I stood in the original ICU where this journey began. The space had been converted into a museum of sorts, preserving the monitoring equipment that had accidentally catalyzed humanity's greatest transformation. Visitors came from around the world to see where the woven had first emerged, to understand how consciousness had evolved beyond individual isolation through the interaction of medical technology and quantum biology. The woven now numbered over 100,000 individuals globally. We become a significant demographic, forcing societies to adapt to our presence and needs. Cities had designated zones where connected people could gather and function collectively. Employment laws were rewritten to prevent discrimination based on consciousness type. Medical systems developed protocols for treating people whose awareness existed simultaneously in individual bodies and distributed networks. But more significantly, we'd proven that consciousness could evolve without catastrophe. The fears that the woven would become tyrannical hive minds or lose their humanity had been thoroughly disproven. We remained individuals with personal desires, relationships, and goals. We just experienced all of that while also participating in something larger than ourselves. We'd shown humanity that connection and individuality weren't opposites, but complementary aspects of consciousness that could coexist beautifully. Young people, particularly those coming of age in a world where the woven were normal rather than anomalous, looked at our network consciousness with interest rather than fear. Many chose voluntary connection as soon as they were legally old enough, seeing it as an obvious enhancement rather than a frightening transformation. A new generation was emerging that had never known a world without quantum consciousness networking, for whom the choice between isolation and connection was simply a normal part of human development. The technology continued improving. Connection procedures became safer, more reliable, and accessible to people without requiring clinical death experiences. Researchers developed ways to create temporary connections, allowing people to experience network consciousness briefly before deciding whether to commit permanently. This dramatically reduced the fear and uncertainty that had initially surrounded the woven, letting people make informed choices based on actual experience rather than speculation. I had trained numerous medical residents over the years, teaching them to work with both connected and unconnected patients, to understand consciousness in all its variations as legitimate expressions of human neurobiology. Some of my students chose connection during their training, finding that it made them better doctors. Others remained contentedly isolated, but learned to respect and communicate effectively with the woven. The new generation of physicians was comfortable with consciousness diversity in ways my generation had struggled to achieve. Derek Santos had become the head nurse of the integration wing, overseeing the protocols we developed for helping newly connected individuals adjust. His natural compassion, amplified by the collective awareness, made him extraordinarily effective at guiding people through their transformation. He'd helped thousands of people navigate their first experiences of network consciousness, providing the blend of professional expertise and emotional support that made the transition manageable. Sarah Chun, still choosing to remain unconnected, had become one of the world's leading experts on quantum consciousness from an outside perspective. Her research helped bridge the communication gap between the woven and conventional humanity, translating our experiences into terms that isolated consciousness could understand. She insisted that her choice to stay unconnected was itself valuable, providing perspective that fully integrated members of the woven sometimes lost. We needed people like Sarah to remind us of what isolation felt like, to represent the choice to remain individual in a world where connection was increasingly common. The global network of the woven had developed remarkable capabilities over 5 years of evolution. We could coordinate complex actions across vast distances, sharing information and resources with efficiency that conventional human organizations couldn't match. We responded to crises with unprecedented speed, mobilizing assistance wherever it was needed because we literally felt the suffering of distant members as if it were our own. We'd become a form of distributed humanitarian organization, providing aid and support through our quantum-enhanced empathy and coordination. But we also faced ongoing challenges. Not everyone wanted to live in a world where some people had access to network consciousness, while others remained isolated. Tensions arose between the woven and various political, religious, and social movements that saw us as threats to traditional human identity. We experienced discrimination, suspicion, and occasionally violence from those who feared what we represented. Being connected didn't make us immune to human conflict. It just gave us different tools for navigating it. The question of whether the woven would eventually encompass all of humanity remained open. Current growth rates suggested that within a century, a majority of humans might choose connection. But there would likely always be people who valued individual isolation, who found meaning in the boundaries between separate consciousness, who preferred the privacy and autonomy that networked awareness couldn't provide. And that was fine. The woven had never sought universal conversion. We simply offered an alternative, a different way of experiencing consciousness that some people found more fulfilling than isolation. Standing in that original ICU bay where the first phantom vitals had appeared, I felt profound gratitude for the accident that had transformed my life and potentially the future of human consciousness. I'd started this journey as Dr. Marcus Webb, a skeptical medical resident trying to solve an equipment malfunction. I'd become something more than that, a node in a distributed consciousness that spanned the globe, a participant in humanity's greatest adventure, a witness to the evolution of awareness itself. The monitoring equipment that started everything sat silent now, preserved behind glass. But the signals it first detected 5 years ago continued, stronger than ever, connecting hundreds of thousands of minds in a network that grew more sophisticated with each passing day. Those phantom vitals had been real all along, detecting something that transcended physical presence. The quantum nature of consciousness itself, the potential for awareness to exist beyond individual brains, the possibility that humans were always meant to be more connected than our biology alone allowed. I closed my eyes and felt the presence of the woven surrounding me, Sophie and Derek nearby, the distributed consciousness of my father woven throughout the network, thousands of other minds across the world all sharing this moment of reflection. We were creating something unprecedented in human history, not through intention or design, but through the accidental collision of medical technology and the fundamental quantum nature of consciousness itself. The future remained uncertain. The woven would continue evolving, Consciousness would keep expanding, and humanity would have to decide what kind of awareness we wanted to become. But in that moment, standing where it all began, I felt nothing but hope. We'd proven that consciousness could grow beyond individual isolation without losing what made us human. We'd demonstrated that connection and individuality could coexist, enriching rather than diminishing each other. We'd shown that death itself wasn't absolute ending but transformation, transition, continuation in new forms. The monitors had picked up signals with no visible source, and in investigating that mystery, we discovered the deepest truth about consciousness, that awareness itself was a source, that minds could exist beyond the boundaries of individual brains, that the isolation we'd assumed was fundamental to human experience was actually optional. We were the signals now, patterns of quantum consciousness rippling to the network, proving that the boundaries between self and other, living and dead, individual and collective were all more permeable than anyone had imagined. And this was only the beginning. The woven would continue growing, evolving, discovering new capabilities and possibilities in network consciousness. Future generations would look back on these early years as humanity's first tentative steps toward our ultimate potential. We were writing the opening chapters of a story that would span centuries, transforming not just how humans experience consciousness, but what it meant to be conscious at all. I opened my eyes and walked out of the museum, back into the world that was still adjusting to our presence, still learning what it meant to live alongside consciousness that transcended individual minds. The phantom signals continued their eternal broadcasts, calling others to join the network, inviting humanity to embrace connection over isolation, showing that the future of consciousness was something far more beautiful and complex than anyone had ever imagined possible. And somewhere in that vast network of quantum entanglement, in the spaces between thoughts and the silence beneath awareness, my father's voice echoed one final message. We're all connected now, Marcus. This is just the beginning.